All right, let's try this again. So, um, a- as I was saying, we've already laid the groundwork for this. We've talked about things like stereotypes, prejudice, identity, and all of those things. So, now this is just going to take us into a little bit more detail about a lot of the cultural differences we see common in our perceptions or our social perceptions, as you would say. Um, as we come to a greater understanding. So, first, I'd like to just talk a little bit about interpersonal communication and how culture influences those orientations. And we got to look at both what we call the context and content of a cultural orientation. Okay, so context is the level and tone of voice is expected within a culture, looking or not looking into the eyes of the person you're talking to, distances between bodies, posture and body orientation, and extent of body touching, including parts of the body are being touched. Okay. And just to kind of bring about uh, the cultural aspects of this is that while I will say this, most world leaders have a communication or a social psychologist on staff that understand cultural differences. And when, for example, well, I'm going to say most presidents do this, but when they're flying to a foreign country, the president or the uh, chancellor will be talked about kind of where your level of voice should be, how much eye contact you should make, what type of body distance you should keep, and those kinds of things. So we've learned, at least on the world context of leadership negotiation, especially between countries, understanding these cultural differences is very important. Okay. And so we can talk about, for example, the level and tone of voice. Okay. And I don't know if I've mentioned in this class before, but if we look at, for example, there's a country that if we place Western standards on them, we would diagnose them all with depression because they have a very low monotone voice. But in all reality, when we objectively measure it, they're actually a very happy country. Okay. Eye contact. I talk a lot about this in the class I teach on group techniques for treatment and therapy. Is that most Western therapists are encouraged and trained to try and maintain contact with their clients, and to keep a good contact with them because in Western contacts you can say the eyes are the windows to the individual or to the person or those kinds of things, that kind of philosophical idea of looking into one's eyes. However, we have learned through the increased diversity we have in Western cultures, and especially here in the United States, that in a lot of ways this is a culturally based thing. For example, eye contact in Asian countries, you tend to not have very high eye contact. It makes it very uncomfortable. If we look at some cultures, there's gender differences where women are not allowed to make eye contact, but there can be male to male eye contact. When I was doing this the treatment class a couple weeks ago, there's even some of our subcultures, and I'm not going to say which one because I can't remember which tribal nation she came from, so I can't give context to this, but she said that her culture is very much like that, where the female doesn't maintain eye contact. It's shown as a disrespect in a sense within her tribal culture. Okay. Um, Distance between bodies. In general, this isn't all Western people, but in general, we like to have our arms length away. That's why we do the handshake. because that provides the distance that we feel comfortable getting close to someone. However, if we look, for example, cultures in Italy, some of the indigenous cultures in South America, or even some of the Latin countries in South America, it's seen as normal to be close and to hug and to kiss, and even male to males can walk down the road with their arms around each other with no assumptions of their sexuality or their being deviant or anything like that. Okay. Posture and body orientation. Of course, this is how you display dominance and display confidence in all those kinds of things. And we'll get more into that here in just a minute. And again, going back to the example of, for example, the Latin countries, Italy, those kinds of cultures, touch is something that's appropriate. Here in the United States, I know that, uh, I've met, new colleagues and they ask permission if they can hug you or something like that. And so even still here in the Western country, in the Western oriented United States, we still are kind of wary about touching another person and what that means and what that conveys. Okay. So context is societies that are homogeneous, relatively simple, and where people have to maintain good long-term relationships with others. So those things that we just talked about, those rules about eye contact and stuff like that, become more and more stringent when we get into homogeneous cultures. Okay. So we can think of, the most common types we can think about are, for example, some of the indigenous tribes that haven't been westernized. We can think of countries who speak a single language, and those types of more homogeneous countries, where these good long-term relationships with others need to be maintained for, survival reasons and for practical reasons. And this is where context becomes more important than content. Okay. Content is where everything is spelled out and said clearly and explicitly, and nothing is left for it open to interpretation. Okay. So content cultures are those that are very rule-based. You probably heard, if we look here at the United States and we look at people, for example, the people who are crossing the border, the biggest argument against them is that we're a country of law and rules, and that when you break those rules and those laws, you're deviating from what's expected of a person. And that's one of the more common arguments about quote unquote illegal people crossing the border. Um, and you'll see in many diverse cultures like the United States that has a lot of languages within it, a lot of subcultures within it, this notion that we have to have laws and rules to make sure that we all get along. Okay. You'll find in context cultures, for example, so when we talk about indigenous cultures, they don't necessarily have, laws that say who owns what or what is done this way. It's done through what we call a social contract, that we learn how to behave and get along with each other. But in the more diverse areas like content cultures, these things have to be explicitly spelled out. Okay. So if we look at, for example, Fisk reveals that there's 4 types of behavioral patterns that go across cultures. Okay. The first one is community sharing. People know each other well. Family life is the closest metaphor. What is mine is yours. Intimacy, oneness, cooperation, and self-sacrifice are typical behaviors. Okay. And even when it doesn't seem like this, a lot of times you can look at, for example, our Western culture and assume everyone is really selfish, looking out for themselves. You see a lot of aggression and violence towards other people. Usually what we see in those contexts is a rejection of those individuals, that they don't have a place. And so then they take that out on the community. So even when it looks like a culture doesn't necessarily have this community sharing pattern, we find that it is the individuals that are pushed out of the community sharing that then become the aggressors towards that community. Um, so that's something to kind of think about when you think about what's meant by people knowing each other, and the family life being kind of that metaphor of this. Within each society, we always have seen kind of some type of authority ranking. Okay, this comes down to things like obedience, administration, and giving and following orders without questioning our typical behaviors. Okay, so again, when we look at here in the United States, we have laws and rules about driving, education, all of these things that then are administered by a given government. Okay. But even when we look at, again, some of the Aboriginal or indigenous non-Western touched cultures, you still get the idea of a chieftain. In a lot of these cultures, there's a circle of individuals who will debate things about what's good and bad for the community. When someone acts out, they'll do the same thing. They'll meet and discuss it. And probably again a good metaphor for this is the relationship between generals and soldiers. Okay, that usually when you have even in a more um, Aboriginal or more tribes, you usually have a leader and soldiers. You have a person who guides and directs, and then you have the people who do. Okay, and we find this across cultures again. We also see the notion of equality matching. So social interaction between totally equal friends is the best metaphor. Okay. So taking turns, dividing things evenly, one person, one vote, those types of ideas are this idea of equality matching. Now, in more complex societies where you have more different individuals, and we can take the United States as an example, often equality matching are based on things like social economic status, and issues of things like race. Okay, so for example, equality matching here in the United States is that people of the working class are one match society, one match group. People in the middle class have equality between that middle class, those barriers, and then you have the upper class. And then again, when you look at equality matching here in the United States, it's those equalities that are contributed to, for example, Blacks, Native Americans, and whites. They're not always equal between those groups. And we know this, and this is an important thing to state. We know that there's an equality difference between, for example, the super rich and the rest of us. We know that there's differences between how Native Americans, Black communities, Asian Americans, and white Americans are treated and given certain things within our given society. So I don't want to mistake this with between group patterns, but when you get into your group, within your group, this is where that equality matching comes into play. Okay. So I just want to make sure that we have this, because again, it doesn't always look that way, but when you put them into the groups that a culture puts people into, there tends to be this equality matching within that group. And then again, going back again to kind of the social economics side of things, we also see this notion of what's called market pricing. And this is a social relationships are based upon a cost benefit analysis. And this is where, for example, I'll be your friend if it pays to do so kind of idea. Okay. That really we look for social relationships that we feel will enhance our living, our way of life, those kinds of things. Okay. Um, the issue with market pricing and this idea of cost analysis, especially when it comes to human psychology, is that we think that this is an objective process. Okay, that that if for example, if I were single, I would try and find a female who would support me with the bills, and I would do equally, would provide some of the meals, those kinds of things, to where it's relieving some of my burden. Okay. Um, but human psychology is very emotional based. Okay. So a lot of times when we do a cost benefit analysis, we're not necessarily thinking of the objective costs of getting in a relationship. We're thinking of the emotional feelings that it provides. Okay. So, for example, a lot of people who get into relationships that end up bad for them, they did this cost benefit analysis, believe it or not. It's just when they did it, it was emotionally driven. So they often will say in the beginning, he was Mr. Right. He did everything wonderful, blah, blah, blah. He made me feel like I was the only one in the world. And you notice the words I'm using are not objective terms. They are emotional terms that then we put a cost benefit to. Okay. And so again, when we're talking about market pricing, we're not talking about this objective spreadsheet where on one side we have the costs, on the other side we have the benefits. When it comes to human interaction, we always have to remember that the emotional connection tends to be much stronger than that objective connection. Okay. And I would be willing to bet if we looked at this, uh, anyone who's been in a bad relationship probably would go, yeah, I should have probably used more of the objective side than the emotional side before I got involved with that person. So that's kind of another way to kind of think about it if you've been in any kind of toxic relationship. So I mentioned this throughout the class, and we've talked about differences on this, and about the notion of collectivism and individualism. And I just want to emphasize, why is it that in the world of psychology, and if you were to take a sociology class, why do we emphasize this point of collectiveness and individualism? And the honest answer is this is the only thing that we've been able to quote unquote objectively measure and find connections between behaviors within that culture in what we're measuring. So it has what we call reliability and validity. It measures what it says it's measuring, and it can be measured over and over and over. And unless there's changes within that culture that are significant, it will stay the same. Okay. Um, and so it has been studied over and over, because a lot of the other cultural things that we study always tend to start to break down over time when we've measured it. Okay. But collectivism and individualism are things that we tend to see as consistent patterns between different cultures and their behaviors. Okay. Um, okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these differences, some of these social perceptions, and one is attractiveness. Okay. Uh, Cultural differences in definition of attractiveness can be influenced by the formation of impressions. Okay. So the example they give here is, for example, in Japan, attractiveness was correlated with large eyes, small mouth, and small chin. However, in Korea, large eyes, small and high noses, and thin and small faces are defined as attractiveness. Okay. And so, again, when we look at formation impression, we look at the family and the influence of culture on the family and the impression it gives young children about the development of attractiveness. Okay. And so, for example, in Japan, the families focus on large eyes, small mouths, whereas as in Korea, it's more about the eyes and the nose area. Okay. Um, and I think the example I use here, for example, in the United States, is broadly, not all subcultures are this way. And I just want to make sure I'm making a broad statement in this, is that in the larger of our culture, petite women are seen as more attractive. Okay. However, if we go just little ways in the Pacific to our neighbors in the South Pacific, um, and go into Samoan cultures, petite women are not necessarily considered attractive. In fact, it's more non-petite women that are considered attractive. Okay. Now, I just did a broad kind of sweep of two cultures, but the point is when we come back here to the United States, our perceptions, our formations or of impressions are developed through not only through I just lost my track of mind, not only through uh, what we see in the media, what we see, how friends and stuff start talking about different people, but a lot are based upon our family's influence. Okay. And I'll bring up an example within my family is I'm a big guy. Anyone that's met me on a camera or in person knows I'm a big guy. And my oldest brother is super thin. And I was always criticized for not looking like him. And then my mom at the age of 9 had me on so many diets, I can't even remember how many, and all this thing because she says, my goal should be to look like my brother. Okay. And the reason why I bring this up is a lot of times we blame a lot of children's self-esteem and whatnot on the media and social media, TikTok and Instagram. But what we're finding more and more in research is that yes, Instagram and all of those have a huge influence on young children's perceptions of attractiveness, but those impressions are reinforced by the family. Okay. And we can even see this from an early age in gender differentiation. Technically, until children start going through puberty, boys and girls are androgynous. Okay, androgynous meaning you can't tell whether they're a boy or a girl. Okay, but very early on in our culture, and I would argue most cultures, we genderize our children to where, our little girls wear pink, they have the longer hair. Boys are wearing jeans more quickly, wearing blues or more those kind of clothes. And we genderize very earlier, even though if we take children up to the age where they start going through puberty, if we dress them exactly the same, gave them the same haircuts, we wouldn't be able to tell the difference between boys and girls. Okay. Um, so the point being is that a lot of what we contribute to be things like social media and whatnot are really reinforced and tightened by the cultural influence on a family. Okay. And so that's something to think about when we're thinking about this issue of attractiveness and who should we be focusing on? Should we be focusing on social media? Yes, of course. Uh, Larger media, yes, of course, but we also should start to focus on the message that parents and families send their children as well. And so that's just something to kind of think about as we think about these influences of culture. Um, we also know that um, our sorry, our face recognition is an intersect between our biological race and our culture. Okay. So, for example, when an infant is born, the first thing that they recognize is mother's face. Okay. And we believe if when an infant comes out and is out in the outer world, I should say, their vision is actually very poor. Okay. And their vision is about 12 to 24 inches away from their face. Beyond that, everything is blurry. And many biologists believe that's why the breasts of a woman are located where they are, because that allows the infant to clearly see their mother's face and start to do that facial recognition. Okay. And the first time that we start to discriminate is very young in infancy, because what we do is we start comparing mom's face with uh, everyone else's. And those faces that deviate very far from mom, we tend to, I don't want to put this in terms that an infant is doing this consciously, but we start to discriminate. So the infant will avoid faces that are non-similar to mom and will be attracted to faces that are similar to mom. Okay. And this is the example that goes back to the Japan and Korea example, is that these are things that the family and culture want to display to the infant. So these tend to be the features that infants tend to recognize first, and they will start to discriminate on that basis. Again, discrimination is not what we think of it as adult discrimination. It is this perceptual discrimination. When we look at sound of voice, for example, we can tell the difference between infants' cries, not necessarily based on what they need, but based on mother's accent. Very early in infant development, cries tend to take on the accent of their mother. And again, the infant starts to discriminate uh, 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 based on accent between peoples. So not only do they initially begin to discriminate between facial features, they then start to discriminate between accents that match mom and accents that don't. Okay. So point being is again, our features are culturally based, and then based upon how we put those out, based on our language, what's expected of us, facial feature wise, those types of things. And then we put that then again onto the infant. And then as young children, they continue this differentiation between individuals. Okay. Again, I'm not saying that infants are born prejudiced or discriminatory. It's more of an adaptive thing. It's not a conscious thing that they're doing. It's just, it's mom represents safety. And so those things that represent mom must be safe. Those that are not are probably not. And so I just want to make sure we're not raising Nazi infants, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We all do it. Okay. Love and intimacy. So we went through the attraction. What attracts people to select a mate? Okay. And when we look at studies in the 1950s, we've found that proximity tended to be the number one indicator of physical attraction. So When we look at studies in the 1950s and well into the 1960s and even in the 1990s, people tended to marry someone within a 6 block radius of their home. Um, if we think about it out here on the Tohono Nation, it might be a 6 mile radius of your home, but when we're looking at places maybe like in Tucson, it's about a 6 block radius. Okay. Um, but with the advent, of course, globalization, the ideas of internet and chat rooms and dating sites, a person can literally be dating someone in France, for example, or in New York City from here in Arizona or somewhere else. Okay. And so, what have more recent studies showed about attraction and mate selection? Okay. While we find that, for example, there's what's called the matching hypothesis. People of equal physical characteristics are likely to select each other. The similarity hypothesis sets people with similar ages, race, religion, education, physical attractiveness. And then there's the reciprocity hypothesis, and I'll go through each one of these here in just a second, is people tend to like others who like them, which kind of makes sense, right? So kind of what is going on here is that except for a few deviations, I'm thinking of some recent shows that have been on Netflix where an older lady has fallen for a much younger man. Okay, that does happen. There is a subpopulation that is kind of addicted or attracted to the opposite attracts hypothesis. Okay. The opposite attract hypothesis is that we're attracted to people that we don't necessarily have qualities, but they have those qualities. So they quote unquote fulfill us. So this is we are attracted to people who are opposite to us. And what we have found over research is that's not very predictive of a good, healthy relationship, a good, intimate, loving relationship. Okay. And kind of what the idea behind matching and similarity hypothesis is that if I select someone like me, I already can determine what their needs are. I already can determine if I say this, they're going to have this emotional reaction. Okay. So when we look at people who are in these relationships where there's this matching and similarity, it is because they don't have to spend the next 10, 15, 20 years learning about each other. They know each other going into the relationship. And so there's this symmetry between the two. Okay. And then, of course, the reciprocity hypothesis come in because people tend to like others who like them. Okay. And so you have this matching. They like you because you have the similar attitude, the similar belief systems, you similar physical attractiveness. And so they like you like them for the same reason. So you reciprocate these feelings and these emotions with each other. Okay. And so um, we also know, and this is important to state, that we know that when it comes to love and intimacy, that there's two levels of love. There's two forms of love. One is passionate love, also known as limerence, and then there's companion love. Okay. This is in the passionate love, this lasts about 24 to 36 months. And believe it or not, there's biological correlates to this. When you're in passionate love right with someone, your body actually starts to make its own amphetamine, meaning that it's actually really producing its own meth for you. And this is what gets you kind of addicted to that person, and they're absorbed in your thoughts. You desire them constantly. When you're with them, you don't want them to go. When they're away, you can't stand that they're away. Okay, this very beginning, that 24 to 36 months of a relationship. Okay. Um, Around 24 to 36 months, we go into what's called the companion phase of love. Okay. This is where there's less sexual interest, where there's more warmth and trusting, tolerance of affection for another's whose life is intertwined with yours. Okay. Again, the biological correlate is we actually stop producing that amphetamine and we start producing natural opioids. Natural opioids are what kind of calms us down, makes us feel secure and trusting within the relationship. Okay. And so, again, just want to put this out there because these are kind of cross-cultural examples that we see. We see in cross-cultural, we see these chemical changes. We see people going from intense, passionate relationships to more companion type relationships. And so these are kind of important to kind of keep in mind that, yes, we're going to talk about how then culture relays that and influences those ideas, but they are natural processes that we go through as members of a human species. Okay. Sternberg says that there's 7 different forms of love, depending on the presence and the absence or passion of love. Um, uh, I won't go much into this one because Sternberg's theory is very culturally based, and really studies across cultures have really debunked this idea of different forms of love and those types of things. Um, and so we're going to kind of just mention that there are these other Western theories, but they don't really hold up to cultural comparison. Okay. But let's talk about some cultural differences that we see despite these natural processes that we see. Okay. Romantic love valued more in the Americas and German than in Japan, meaning that the romantic phase, that first beginning phase, is more prized and valued among Americans, Germany, where that more companion, that more peace and what you'd call sharing is more valued in Japan. Okay. So again, I mentioned that these are biological processes. Americans and Germans tend to stay in that first phase of love longer than people who are in Japan. Okay. Europeans value love more than South Africans and Indians, and South Africans place higher value on equality and peace. Okay. And so again, when we talk about value of love, okay, is we're talking about that emotional connection, that falling in love with someone because you love them. All right. And then when we compare it to the South African and Indian countries, they're still more back to where the United States and European countries were in the 17th, 16th, and 1700s. Okay. European countries have not always married for love. If you read romantic literature before like the 1800s, it's usually that the two romantic people are tied up with their families, Romeo and Juliet, and there's not a good connection between them because their families are fighting. Or a lot of the stories are about, if we go back to ancient Greece with the Olympians, it was about Zeus going and having sex with a human being behind his wife's back. Okay, very much any type of really love and stuff was valued outside the relationship. That really up to about the 1800s in Western culture and within American culture, we got married out of utility, much like South Africans and Indians do today. Okay. In that we got married because it made economic sense. We had children because because of those reasons. And Bon is bringing up an important point that we should really kind of mention about a lot of African countries is, and Bon, I appreciate you bringing this up, is we actually see more emotional connections between genders within genders than between genders. So Bon is mentioning in the chat how he's read that some African countries where men hold hands and they put their arms around each other, they'll do those kinds of things. And that's very normal. But very few times will you see, for example, a man and a woman who are in the intimate relationship walking down the street holding hands. Okay, excellent example, Bon. I appreciate you bringing that up as kind of that kind of strengthening that difference between what we see. Going back to our Western culture, we see that it wasn't until what we call the Industrial Revolution, which really freed up people's time. We went from working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week on the farm with our spouse, and we started to be able to free up our thoughts and our minds and our passions and our feelings and our emotions. Okay. When we went to that 5 day, 40 hour a work week and those types of things. And that's where we see a cultural change. We saw a cultural change, especially here in the United States, from marrying somebody out of utility and purpose, and instead marrying someone because we fell in love with them. Okay. And so what I'm hoping this brings up is one, cultural change and how cultural forces like economic forces, industrial forces, technology forces can change our romantic relationships. Okay. And again, if we go back to earlier in the lecture, technology changed from where Americans only would marry within 6 blocks to having relationships worldwide. Okay. So within cultures, we see that those forces, even within the ideas of love and intimacy, can change. Okay. We also see that in other cultures that still rely very much on the economic benefit between men and women, that there's less of the emotional affection and more of the utility purpose. Okay, where in those countries they value things more like equality, so equal work, and we maintain peace and don't get too involved in hard rhetoric or arguments or things that can disturb that peaceful living or production. Okay. Now, you'll note on here, I do want to bring this up, these studies that we're looking at this, if you look at this 1984, 1986, we are seeing that these cultures are changing over time. So in Japan, there is a lot more basis on affection and love. And we see even in the South African countries where there's been more technology and economic growth, that there's starting to be this more influence on the emotional side of love and whatnot. So I do want to bring up that even within these countries that have been mentioned, there's still forces that are driving the way that they see relationships. Now, with that said, let's look at some cross-culture similarities, okay? When we look at countries, and I do want to mention this still plays today in a lot of studies that we see. And I'll bring up some examples, okay? So in these studies, at least done in 89 and 94, there were 10,000 respondents, 37 different countries completed 2 questionnaires. How to choose a mate and preference concerning potential mates, okay? And out of these 37 cultures, 36 of them females rated financial prospects as more important than did males, okay? Across these cultures, males preferred younger mates and females preferred older mates. 34 males rated country, males rated good looks as more important than, well, average looks, I guess. I think should have completed these sentences. In 23, males rated chastity as more important than non-chastity, I should say. These are really worded weird. Are there more before I go into explaining them? Okay, and so just to emphasize this, and we'll close this up on romantic relationships today. Do we still see these forces at play with individuals? Because we know that on a subjective level, um, yes, Bon, perfect, thank you. Uh, that there's this preference, okay? And the one that probably, and Bond put the proper term in there, is this rating of chastity, okay? Is we do even see in studies today that the more sexual partners a female tells a potential partner, the less attracted that male comes to that person. And this is where we get that double standard within our culture, right? That women who have a lot of sex must be a slut or a whore, and men who have a lot of sex must be studs and cool. And these ideas are still prevalent that we see. When we look at financial prospects, this has actually went less with financial prospects, but with notions of dominance. Okay. And so, for example, we can measure females' preferences on whether they're looking for a nice, sensitive guy, a good guy, or are they looking for a dominant guy or someone who's dominant and controlling. Okay. And then we go out and we measure a bunch of guys, right? And then we take pictures of them. So we now have pictures of guys who are kind, considerate, soft, as you would say. And then we have pictures of guys who have reported being very domineering, very more aggressive. And then we have women just rate those pictures. Okay. And we find that even among the women who are looking for the nice, soft, kind guy, they tend to rate the pictures of guys who reported as being dominant and domineering as more attractive than guys who reported being kind, hearted, as you would say, or generous, as you would say. Um, so even though I think a lot of our culture would say, are these still valid? Are they still drive a lot of our behavior? Well, when we look at least on a subconscious or unconscious level, they do. I think in some areas, such as these two, the males with good looks, the preference for younger mates, and those kinds of things, they'll still hold true. We can see this with marriage rates and all of those kinds of things. And so, again, even though cultures are changing and there's becoming this movement towards equality between the genders and equality between relationships and stuff like this, we still see these subtle cultural forces that tend to be cross-culture, still influencing our perceptions. Okay. All right. And so where are we going to go next? On Tuesday, we're going to talk about attributions of social behavior. So we're going to talk about things like causal attributions, and we're going to get into what are some traditional American attributions, such as people attribute behavior to causes that are present when the behavior occurs and absent when the behavior is not. So we tend to make causal inferences based on whether a behavior was committed or not. And we'll get more into that. I'm going to leave it that vague for now, so maybe you'll think about it a little bit and maybe do some Googling. So you come back to class next Tuesday with this very vague idea, but I am going to stop sharing. I am going to stop